She said, "Don't call me Mrs." And in that moment, I realized she didn't want a title. She wanted to be seen. I never planned on noticing her the way I did. She was just my neighbor at first, someone I passed by with a polite nod, someone I greeted with the casual warmth people in quiet neighborhoods tend to share. But sometimes, the simplest details in life turn into the most unforgettable ones. She was 42, elegant in a way that didn't demand attention but always caught mine. She carried herself with a quiet grace, the kind that comes from years of knowing exactly who you are. She had a presence about her, calm, steady, and yet, beneath it, I sensed something unsettled. Most afternoons, I'd see her outside, tending to the line of potted plants along her porch. The late sun would spill across the neighborhood, painting everything in a soft golden glow. And there she'd be, her hair loosely tied back, strands falling free, brushing her cheek with every small gust of wind. She'd wear simple clothes, often a loose blouse and light jeans, but somehow she made ordinary things look timeless. It was the way she looked at the world that first held me. She had this gaze, not sharp, not searching, but heavy, like she carried thoughts she could never say out loud. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, her shoulders would drop, and a tired sigh would escape her lips. I pretended not to notice, but I always did. At 25, I didn't have much figured out. I was still stumbling my way through life, working odd hours, still learning who I wanted to be. And yet, every time I saw her, it was as if the air shifted, like her presence asked me to slow down, to pay attention. One evening stands out in my memory like a scene etched in glass. The sun was low, and the street was bathed in that fleeting, amber light that makes everything look softer than it really is. I was coming back from a run, sweat clinging to my shirt, when I saw her kneeling by her roses. She looked up at me, her hand brushing dirt from her fingers, and for the first time, our eyes locked longer than a passing glance. Her smile was small, hesitant even, but it carried warmth. I nodded a greeting, a little breathless from running. "Evening," I managed. "Evening," she echoed, her voice low, almost careful. It was nothing more than that, a single word exchanged across the fading light. But something in the way she said it stayed with me. It wasn't just a neighbor acknowledging another. It felt like the beginning of something unspoken. From then on, I found myself noticing her more. The way she paused before locking her door, as though reluctant to go inside. The way her laughter, faint and rare, carried across the fence when she was on the phone. And most of all, the way her eyes seemed to linger on me just a fraction longer than they should have. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew better. That was the first spark, the one that changes everything without a sound. The first real conversation we shared happened on a quiet evening, the kind where the whole neighborhood felt half asleep. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting long shadows across the fence that separated her yard from mine. I was taking out the trash, an ordinary task, when I saw her standing there, arms folded, eyes fixed on the ground as though she was waiting for something. I hesitated. A part of me wanted to just keep walking, to nod politely and carry on. But something about her posture that night felt heavier, as if the weight of her thoughts had finally spilled onto her shoulders. So I stopped. "Evening, Mrs. Bennet," I said gently, careful not to startle her. She looked up, and for a brief second, her expression hardened. It wasn't anger exactly, but a quiet resistance, like I had touched a bruise I wasn't supposed to know about. Her lips parted, and she shook her head faintly. "Don't call me that," she said. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it was firm enough to silence me. I blinked, caught off guard, the name still hanging awkwardly between us. She must have noticed my confusion because she exhaled and softened her voice. I just don't like it." There was something in her eyes then, not irritation, but vulnerability. The kind of look that spoke of years of being addressed by a title that didn't feel like hers anymore. A name that bound her to a role, a life that maybe no longer matched who she was inside. I nodded slowly, wanting to respect her wish, even though I barely understood it. "All right," I said, trying to offer her a small smile. "What should I call you then?" For a moment, She didn't answer. Instead, she let out the faintest laugh, dry and almost self-mocking. "Just me," she murmured. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, charged with something unspoken. The sound of distant crickets filled the gap between us, and the cool night air carried the scent of her lavender plants over the fence. I leaned lightly against the post, careful not to intrude, and search her face. "You look like you could use some company," I said quietly. Her eyes flicked toward me, cautious, yet grateful. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. Instead, she tilted her head toward the porch steps, a silent invitation. I took it. We sat across from each other, not too close, not too far, just two neighbors sharing space under the dim porch light. She wrapped her arms around herself as if the night air was colder than it really was. I found myself watching the way the light curved along her cheekbones, how her jaw tensed and relaxed with every pause in our conversation. We didn't talk about anything extraordinary, just small things, the weather, her garden, my late shifts. But beneath every casual word was an undercurrent, a quiet rebellion against the boundary of neighbor and Mrs. At one point, I almost slipped and called her by that title again. But she cut me off with a glance, sharp but fragile, as if begging me to see her differently. And I did. From that night on, she wasn't just Mrs. Bennet. She was a woman, sitting in the twilight, finally allowing herself to be seen. And for reasons I couldn't yet explain, I wanted to be the one who saw her. After that night on her porch, something between us quietly shifted. The barrier that had always existed, that unspoken line of polite distance, had thinned. We weren't just neighbors anymore. There was a softness now, a familiarity, though neither of us dared to name it. It began in small, almost invisible ways. A wave when I left for work. A smile when she caught me returning late at night. Sometimes she'd leave her porch light on longer than usual, almost as if she was waiting to see if I'd glance her way. And I always did. One Saturday afternoon, I saw her struggling with a bag of groceries at the trunk of her car. Without thinking, I jogged across the street to help. She protested at first, a quick, embarrassed shake of her head, but the relief in her eyes betrayed her words. "Thank you," she said as I carried the bags into her kitchen. Her home was quiet, filled with the soft scent of fresh herbs and a faint trace of perfume. It felt lived in but carefully kept, like she had poured her energy into making it warm, even if it sometimes felt empty. She offered me coffee as thanks, and I accepted, though I knew the real reason I stayed had nothing to do with the drink. We sat at her kitchen table, mugs in hand, the afternoon light filtering through thin curtains. The conversation started ordinary, her recipes, my work schedule, but every pause seemed to linger, as though neither of us wanted it to end. Her laughter, though rare, was softer here, free from the weight I'd sometimes seen on her face outside. It was during one of these moments that the first touch happened. It wasn't intentional. She reached across the table to slide the sugar bowl closer to me, and her fingers brushed mine. It was such a light contact, almost nothing, yet I felt it all the way up my arm. She didn't pull back immediately. Neither did I. For a heartbeat, we stayed there, fingertips barely grazing, eyes caught in that invisible thread between us. Later that week, rain began to fall just as I returned home from work. The storm came sudden and heavy, and before I could dash inside, her voice called out from across the porch. "You'll catch cold out there," she said, standing in her doorway. She held the screen open, her expression half command, half concern. I obeyed, stepping into her living room, the rainwater dripping from my hair and shoulders. She fetched a towel, and as she handed it to me, our hands touched again, this time deliberately, firmly. I caught the faintest tremor in her fingers, as though she, too, felt the weight of something growing between us. We sat close that evening, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. The space between us shrank, until her arm brushed against mine on the sofa. She didn't move away. Neither did I. The air smelled of wet earth and lavender from the candle she had lit, and in that quiet storm-lit room, it felt as though the world outside no longer mattered. It was still unspoken, still fragile, but undeniably real. Our bond was no longer just curiosity. It was comfort. It was trust. And beneath it all, it was something we both knew could no longer be ignored. The rain that evening had left the air cool and fragrant, and though the storm had passed, something in me still felt unsettled. After that night on her sofa, after the way her arm had brushed against mine without either of us moving away, I couldn't shake the sense that we were inching closer to a place neither of us had intended to go. A week later, she invited me inside again, this time under brighter circumstances. I had been mowing my lawn when she called over the fence, her voice carrying that calm firmness I had grown used to. "Do you have a minute? I could use a hand with something." I followed her into the living room, where she had an old photo album spread across the coffee table. The edges of the leather cover were worn, the pages filled with frozen moments of a life that seemed both close and distant. She explained that she was reorganizing, but her voice faltered when she lingered too long on certain photographs. I sat beside her, careful not to intrude, yet drawn in by the story the pictures told. There were images of her younger self, smiling beside the man she married, holding their children when they were small. But her hand lingered over those pictures only briefly before moving on, as though she couldn't bear to rest on them for long. At one point, she turned a page and a loose photograph slipped free, fluttering toward me. I reached for it at the same time she did. Her fingers brushed against mine, warmer this time, not fleeting, not accidental. For a moment, neither of us moved. Her hand stayed against mine, trembling just slightly. I looked up at her, and her eyes were already on me. They weren't the polite eyes of a neighbor anymore. They were heavy, uncertain, but full of something deeper, something she wasn't saying out loud. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second pressing down on us. I could feel my heart racing, not because of the photograph, but because of how close we were, how the air between us seemed charged with something unspeakable. She drew in a breath, sharp and shallow, and her lips parted as if she wanted to say something. But no words came. Instead, she let her hand remain on mine for one long, unbroken pause. I could feel her pulse against my skin. I could feel my own answer rising in my throat, but I swallowed it back, afraid of breaking the moment too soon. When she finally pulled her hand away, it wasn't with abruptness, but with hesitation, like someone walking away from a door they desperately wanted to open. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her gaze lowering to the album as though the pages could shield her from what had just passed between us. I leaned back slightly, forcing air into my lungs. The line we had both pretended didn't exist was now visible, bright as day, and we were standing right on its edge. Neither of us said it, but we both knew. The line wasn't going to hold forever. It was late, far later than I should have been awake. The neighborhood lay in silence, the kind of silence where even the hum of a passing car seemed like an intrusion. I stepped outside to clear my head, restless from thoughts I couldn't shake, and that's when I saw her. She was on her balcony, draped in silver moonlight. She leaned against the railing, her robe pulled tightly around her shoulders, hair loose and falling in waves. There was something almost fragile about her then, as if the night had peeled away all the armor she carried in the daylight. For a moment, I just stood there, hidden in the shadows of my own porch, watching. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes tracing the sky like she was searching for an answer among the stars. I knew I should turn back inside, but I didn't. "Mrs. Ben," I called softly before I could stop myself. The name had barely left my lips when she turned sharply, her eyes flashing with a quiet intensity that froze me where I stood. "Don't call me that," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, firm, certain, yet trembling at the edges. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the weight of her words press into me, as though they weren't just about a name. They were about everything: her marriage, her role, the wall she had built to contain herself. I swallowed, my throat dry, my heart pounding louder than the crickets in the yard. She was still watching me, waiting, her fingers gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles showed pale in the moonlight. Something inside me cracked open. Maybe it was the loneliness in her eyes, or maybe it was my own inability to pretend anymore. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Then what do I call you in bed? The question hung between us like a spark, dangerous and electric. For a second, I thought I'd gone too far, that she would turn and disappear inside, slamming the door on me forever. But she didn't. Instead, a sound escaped her, a laugh, shaky and uncertain, but real. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders trembling as if she couldn't believe I had said it. Her eyes softened, though they still carried a storm. "You shouldn't," she whispered, shaking her head. But the way she said it betrayed her. It wasn't a rejection. It was a confession. I took a step closer, just enough for the moonlight to catch my face. I kept my voice low, steady but honest. "I don't see you as Mrs. Bennet," I said. "I see you as you." Her grip on the railing loosened. Slowly, she exhaled, her chest rising and falling with the weight of emotions she could no longer keep hidden. She looked down at me, and for the first time, there was no pretense in her gaze. That night, under the quiet watch of the moon, the truth finally surfaced, not in declarations or promises, but in the trembling silence that followed. We both knew we had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. The night after our balcony exchange, I couldn't sleep. Her voice lingered in my mind, "Don't call me that." And then her laugh, soft and shaken, when I asked what I should call her instead. It wasn't just a name we had spoken about. It was her identity, her longing, and, perhaps, the first hint of a truth neither of us could deny any longer. The following evening, I found myself standing at her door. I didn't plan it. My feet carried me there before my mind could argue. When she opened the door, she looked startled, not unhappy, but surprised, as though she hadn't expected me to be so bold. She was dressed simply, in a loose sweater and dark leggings, her hair falling freely around her face. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside and letting me in. The living room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp. She motioned for me to sit, but she didn't take the chair across from me this time. Instead, she sat beside me on the sofa, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her. We didn't dive straight into words. For a while, silence carried the conversation. I watched her twist her fingers in her lap, her breaths shallow, as though she was building up the courage to let something out. When she finally spoke, her voice was fragile, yet steady enough to cut through the quiet. "You know, people look at me and they see a wife, a mother, someone's Mrs. Bennet." She paused, her lips tightening as if the words themselves tasted bitter. "But no one really sees me anymore." Her confession hit me harder than I expected. There was no anger in it, no bitterness, just a raw honesty that felt heavier than any secret. She turned her face toward me then, her eyes glistening under the soft lamplight. "I get through each day, smiling, keeping the routine, doing what's expected. But inside," she trailed off, shaking her head, "inside, I feel invisible." My chest tightened. I wanted to say something profound, something that could erase the ache in her voice. Instead, I reached out slowly, carefully, until my hand found hers in her lap. Her fingers trembled at first, but didn't pull away. "I don't see you as invisible," I said quietly. "Not for a second. I don't see you as Mrs. Anything. I see you as you." Her breath caught. She turned her palm upward, threading her fingers through mine, gripping tighter, as if she had been waiting for someone to anchor her all along. Then, with a sudden vulnerability, she leaned toward me, her head resting against my chest, her hair brushing under my chin. Her arms slipped around my waist slowly, cautiously, like she was testing whether I'd let her stay there. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders in response, pulling her gently against me. In that moment, I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat, and she must have felt mine, racing with both fear and relief. Neither of us spoke again for a long time. We just sat there, holding on to one another, as though the silence itself had finally become a safe place. It wasn't passion. It wasn't reckless. It was something far rarer, the comfort of finally being seen, fully and honestly, by someone who cared enough to stay. The hours slipped by without either of us noticing. The world outside was silent, save for the hum of crickets and the occasional groan of the wind brushing against the windows. Inside, we sat together on her sofa, my arm wrapped around her, her head resting against my chest as though it belonged there. There was no urgency, no rush toward anything forbidden. It was simply presence. Two people who had been circling unspoken truths finally allowing themselves to pause and breathe in one another's company. I could feel the weight of her body soften gradually, the stiffness of her posture melting away as though she had been carrying armor for years and had finally laid it down. At one point, she shifted slightly, just enough to glance up at me. The lamplight caught in her eyes, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw them without hesitation. There was warmth there, but also a trace of fear of what came next, fear of how fragile this new closeness might be. "I shouldn't be here like this," she whispered, though her cheeks still rested against me. "I know," I said softly, brushing my thumb along the back of her hand where it rested on my chest. "But sometimes the things that shouldn't happen are the ones we need the most." She let out a shaky breath, her lips curving in the faintest smile. Then she sat up just a little, though she didn't pull away entirely. Her hand slipped into mine, her fingers threading through with a firmness that surprised me. She looked down at our hands for a long moment before finally speaking again. "There's something you don't know," she said quietly. "What's that?" She hesitated, her throat working as though the word itself was difficult to release. Then, softly, like it was a secret she hadn't spoken in years, she said my name. I blinked, caught off guard. "Your name?" She nodded, her smile trembling. "Everyone calls me Mrs. Bennett. My husband, the neighbors, even the people at the market. It's like my first name doesn't exist anymore. But I want you to know it." Her words hung in the air, delicate and heavy all at once. And then, with a quiet strength, she whispered it. Her name, just one word. Yet it carried the full weight of who she was beneath all the titles and roles she had been bound to. I repeated it back to her, slowly, like tasting something sacred. She closed her eyes when I said it, her lips parting in a breath of relief. It was as if speaking her name aloud restored something she thought she had lost forever. For a long while after, we said nothing more. I held her close again, her head tucked against my shoulder, her hand warm and steady in mine. The night stretched on, but neither of us minded. It wasn't about grand gestures or promises. It wasn't about breaking rules or defying expectations. It was about this two people sitting in the quiet, finally seen, finally known. And in that moment, I realized sometimes the most powerful love stories aren't the ones shouted from rooftops. They're the ones whispered softly in the dark, where only two hearts are listening. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more slow-burn age gap romance stories. And let me know in the comments, do you believe love can be found in the most unexpected places?